like almost needing the air conditioning in black hole.
Oh, I thought you were speaking like figuratively and poetically and saying that like Los Angeles was ending. It's like the twilight of Los Angeles.
Los Angeles is either ending or beginning, and I'm hopeful that Los Angeles is actually kind of amidst a pretty radical transformation. So it'll either be like a 20th century city that really burns literally or figuratively in the 21st century, or finds or becomes like a really interesting pluralistic model for what like a like large scale first century American city might look like. So, and
So
obviously Black Hole leading the way on the latter.
that sounds probable. Um, but wait a minute. Go off on that a little bit though. Like, why do you feel that Los Angeles is either ending or beginning? I mean, I think there's some obvious associations with California writ large that would lead someone to understand why you might feel like it's ending. But maybe there's some things that we don't know about. But also, even more interestingly, why do you feel like it's possibly a beginning for Los Angeles?
Uh, yeah, I mean, my sense of this is that Los Angeles. I remember like the first time coming here from New York City, particularly. I never knew. I kept feeling like I kept wondering when the city was going to arrive as I drove through what seemed like an endless suburb. Um, and moving here years later, I didn't have like a completely dissimilar feeling. It's more like you have to think about LA as a very large terrain of like multi-centered, semi-autonomous communities that are all kind of tied together. I think the number is something like 130 municipalities and non-incorporated areas, and it's just total chaos. Like actually, so like from an administrative or like political perspective, it's hugely chaotic. Specifically, where Black Hole is in South Los Angeles, um, it's basically like an abandoned area of the city in terms of like planning or cultural services of any kind, social services of any kind. So I think what's optimistic is that um, there is like massive efforts to change LA from like what is like a sprawl of single family houses into something that more approximates. I think if you'd imagine like a mid-sized, large like Asian metropolis, which is really going to have to build up a huge amount, and that'll drive things like meaningful public transportation, affordable housing, or it won't, and it'll become like an incredibly untenable place. But I'm optimistic that there are like really kind of progressive winds blowing here politically, even as the rest of the country is like in a really tricky moment. That makes me feel kind of optimistic.
Word. So, so where you are, tell us more about where you are, where Black Hole is. You kind of said something about it, but where is Black Hole in LA?
Yeah, so if you imagine downtown Los Angeles and you go straight south, um, then about 8 miles south of downtown is Gardena, and we are on one of the main kind of commercial streets in Gardena, which is like let's say the border between South Los Angeles and what people call the South Bay. It has a pretty interesting history of being like primarily Japanese-owned berry farms before internment, and then after internment being one of the areas where like collaboration between developers and Japanese American real estate agents where Asian Americans were allowed to own property. And so Gardena is still kind of like has one of the largest Japanese American populations outside of Japan, but it's also like just an incredibly diverse place otherwise. But the plaza we're on the second floor of a building called the Renai Building, which was built in 1967. And there are many of the original tenants still here, which include like a sushi place that has been serving 5 items, all of which original except one, which is like in the 80s they added the California roll. There's like a dojo downstairs, a dog groomer. Next door is like a family-run dental lab where they mill fake teeth. Um, Travel agency, a video store that kind of like dubs Japanese TV and sitcoms and stuff and rents them to people in the area. So it's like a very particular, um, but one of many such particular places in Los Angeles.
Right. Yeah, there's this like sprawling web of interconnected particular zones.
Mhm.
Where you are, is it like a I have to I've been to LA like half a dozen times, but I've managed to like resist knowing anything about the city really, and not like intentionally. I mean the the verb resist implies that I'm doing it on purpose, which isn't the case. It's just that that diffuse quality makes it hard to remember things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
it's incomprehensible.
if you go to
Yeah.
like Krakow and you go to the
Hmm.
square, then you can remember everything in terms of the square. Do you know what I mean? Whereas when
Hmm.
things are just all spread out and vaguely kind of look alike, it's hard to keep your it's hard to keep it in your memory. You know what I mean? So I don't know anything about the city. So where you are, is it like a weird place for a cultural organization of any sort to be, or is it like a place that people go, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, so like on that tip, like basically you can, there's a few indexes for say like galleries and cultural spaces in Los Angeles. Like the main one I'd say that visualizes this as is a website called curate.la. And you can see on the website basically like the 10 freeway, and that's like funny language out here. People say like the 10 freeway, but the 10 freeway like runs east to west across the city, and basically all of the cultural stuff on that map, with the exception of like Black Hole and like two other things, is basically like north of the 10 or right around the 10 freeway, which is, as I said, like we are still in Los Angeles here, and it is 7 miles north. And so if you think of that in terms of New York City, like the distance between like parts of Brooklyn and cultural spaces in Manhattan are actually like temporally much further than most of those spaces are from Black Hole, but it's extremely concentrated in like you know wealthier, yeah, wealthier, whiter neighborhoods, basically. So I think that when people feel like LA is getting too dense and expensive and crazy, what I say back to people is like, LA is a massive place, and it's really just everyone is trying to live. I mean, most people who are involved with like out music or experimental film, they're living in like Northeast Los Angeles. They're talking about a very specific part of it, which is also the part that most people would visit if they come hang out here. Um, but LA as an actual city and like a conglomeration of many towns and non-towns, it's actually vast and is full of possibility. So I do like actually I feel like the location. I think of it in terms a little bit of where when I first moved to New York, I was working at this place called Diapason, which was like a probably equally idiosyncratic listening room that at that time was like on Sixth Avenue in Midtown, next to a hairdresser, like on the second floor. No one would ever have known it was there, um, and it was like there was something special about the psychic distance from other cultural spaces, and particularly like commercial art world and also music locations where music venues were, that I think really helped create the kind of attention for the work that was happening there. And so in my mind, I'm also thinking like that's that little bit of pilgrimage, which is the wrong word, but just like the psychic distance between where someone might live and arriving here, I actually think helps the possibilities for what the space can be.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was kind of driving at. I want to I want to come back to this thing about people concentrating in a part of the city,
Hmm.
because there's been a it's very similar in New York, obviously,
Hmm.
but I'm going to come back to it. Because I want to hear about this thing about the psychic distance, um, somehow propagating what you're trying to do, or like helping support what you're doing, like that people have to make that journey.
Well, it's like, it takes, and most times of the day you could get down here from the more like central band of Los Angeles in maybe 20, 25 minutes, which I don't consider to be like a particularly like onerous thing. I mean, in New York, it's totally normal. You get on a train, you go 45 minutes an hour. Um, the psychic distance, I think, is important to articulate just that this is not a music venue. It's not an art gallery. It's actually trying to address like a new typology of space for a type of work that now has existed for like 75 years. which is like people really exploring audio specifically um, as a creative material and like set of processes and technologies, and to kind of like put it off center in that way, I think will help people understand when they get here that there's kind of a threshold cross into some uh, other possibility for how we could be thinking about uh, the creation of cultural spaces. So it's also like it's not there's no bar here. It's not financed in that way. It's really run more like financially. It's run more like a cooperative. Um, and so just yeah, I think like that psychic distance is helpful for just allowing people to like not make certain assumptions about what it is or how it's running or why it's here.
Okay, got you. Yeah, there's a lot to get into there, but it occurs to me that something that we should do is make an effort at explaining what black hole is, like just like the elevator pitch. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like we
Yeah,
haven't
sure.
actually said anything about that yet.
Sure, sure. Okay, so like just like basically what black hole is it's an artist-run center for audio. And I'm using audio in like a very specific way and maybe esoteric way based on like writing and thinking and other work that I've been doing really like the past 20 years at this point, which is to think about audio as a technology of representation that's almost like a form of artificial intelligence. We can go deeper on that about how I get there. And also that the way that people use audio in their daily lives now is basically arbitrary and driven by certain convenient decisions for the particular capitalism associated with the recording industry and audio technologies from fairly early on in um, their development as like as a thing that people use in a widespread way. And at the same time, early experiments in audio are not like stereo experiments. They're not like even necessarily about like reproducing reality or reproducing events or being like commercial distribution platforms for activities we do alone in our bedrooms with like mini studios or something. There really are like technologies that are used to define place and make place, and actually like really make social conditions that then uh, move outward into the world, having like established communities around those conditions. So you think about things like um, music festivals in the 60s, like big rock festivals, really, and disco really like drive the creation of audio systems in the way that we know them today. And it's not that those systems existed and people were like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to throw a festival? It's more like people are thinking we want to be together. We want to have some way that we can kind of fuse a social context as a group. And what audio technology does, or really just the speaker component of it, is literally create like a shared airspace that people can live in together temporarily. And so black hole, I think there has always been a kind of like R&D facet to that, which I think usually has been more academically oriented and based in institutions that are kind of hard to access, um, unless you're like have a grant to be there or in school there or something. Certainly that was my experience getting into this stuff. Um, and so the idea was, we have this space here which has like a pretty amazing 16 channel sound system and a totally open-ended program. So it's not only about presenting things, it's about people using the space to make new things. It's about also like hosting an archive of materials that have no place to render them. So there really is like 75 years of spatial audio experiments that are like, there's nowhere you can hear them. You can kind of hear like stereo versions of them here and there, but like that's actually not the work. So, uh, you want to say something, Sam?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, a few things. One quick thing is like your space isn't really about music, right? It's like about audio. Like it's about like I'm sure you get into music, right? Well, I'm not telling you. I'm asking you. Like, do you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
No.
But it's you
Well, this is
understand what I'm
like,
saying? It's like not about music per se. It's about audio and sound, and then sometimes that includes music.
I mean, deep question. I think like where I'm coming from with that topic is thinking like that music is really about human to human communication. And the reason why it's one of the many reasons why it's important to distinguish between the words music, audio, and sound. like we use the words music and audio interchangeably, right? You're listening to headphones, you're like, oh, I'm just like listening to some music. And it's like you wouldn't say that like you have a photograph of some food and you're gonna like eat the photograph. You're gonna like eat the food as a photograph, or you're going to like sleep in a picture of a bed. Like it's really an amazing thing actually that audio was so like the reason why I start going down this road of like audio as some kind of AI even is that it's like if you believe something to be capable of something like transubstantiation, if not actually transubstantiation. Like if you think you're listening to a Coltrane record and you're like, you think like you're experiencing some energy from that human being that's now deceased that encoded this like time sonic material into a medium like long ago, gets transported across time and place, projected back into a new place, and you feel like that's testimony to John Coltrane's humanity, then it's like we're really in some like very magical metaphysical territory that we're ascribing to a technology, which I'm not saying it doesn't do. I think clearly it does something like that, and it works. You know, we're all into this shit because it works. And so asking the questions about audio is really like it's not. It's wondering why and how and what are the possibilities of that. And music for me is like something quite different. Music is like you. Maybe it doesn't even have much to do with sound. It has to do with sound. People use it. Humans using sound to activate their own bodies and like meta bodies in physical space that then create a kind of presence bubble that people participate in, and then there's this whole feedback loop if more people other people are there. So what we say here is like I think what is the exact quote, like the audience are the performers at Black Hole.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's like what I would say is like the listener, you know, listening is interaction, listening is bringing some version of that music to whatever you're listening to. And I think that's kind of one of the possible answers for why listening to recordings of music, representations of music, is so effective. Is that our imaginations around like there's something about audio that tickles our imaginations so well that we can actually bring that sense of humanness and musicness to almost anything. So yeah, but like no, Black Hole is not about music in the normal sense of like there being performances and shows. It's a space for people to listen to these transformations in the airspace through audio.
Right, like it's trying. I'm just telling you what I'm taking away. Like
Yeah,
you're trying to acknowledge that disconnect that is so often overlooked, which you likened to eating the picture of the food or sleeping in the picture of the bed, right? Like we're on the subway, we're listening to John Coltrane experientially, like epistemologically, for all intents and purposes, we're like literally listening to John Coltrane. We're not like you might say I saw a picture of John Coltrane, right? But if you were listening to a John Coltrane record, you wouldn't say I was listening to a recorded representation of John Coltrane playing, right?
yeah,
Like
exactly.
so you're actually trying to acknowledge that. You're trying to say what the experience you're having is an experience of like transformations in the air caused by audio. Now, if it is also a recording of music, that's just more information. It's but like this space is about acknowledging and exploring the potential of audio.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that we're not playing representations of music, but or that the things that we're listening to aren't musical or music. But yeah, I'm trying to like I have been trying to um, draw that distinction, and not for like neurotic reasons, but just because it's actually been the way that my own working through these things as like someone who cares about it and makes things and produces things and has just experienced a lot of different contexts. It feels to me like there's a special place for trying to open up like a new type of cultural space that's dedicated to that particular um, like technology and society art interchange. Um, Now, like in some other version of reality, we have like a big space, we have multiple, multiple venues, and we can address different kinds of things. Sure, but this is like this is the version of it that can be manifest right now. You know?
Yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, one of the things that I wonder when I'm looking at materials about black hole, I've never been to black hole. Um,
Mhm.
it is actually like how much, quote, music, unquote, do you play there? Like, are you playing like Foley and like, nature sounds and like, or is it like just a really sick system to listen to music on dominantly? Or like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I
Yeah,
don't
sorry,
know.
sorry.
Like, what's your
I
programming
didn't give
like?
you like the clearest elevator pitch because I tend to like zoom out to concepts. But like basically the way black hole is operating, you know, it might seem like it's operating this way because of COVID, but actually it was always the plan, which was that it's like basically there are sessions and you can like go on the website and there's a few that are there now and you can just book them online as if you're booking like a ticket to a movie or a massage or whatever. And because the effort it takes to like make a piece function a black hole is basically to mix it specifically for this room. Once that investment has been made, the piece lives here forever until we move or the artist doesn't want it to be up or whatever it is. So it's not that like it's like an anti-scarcity model where it's more like we are assembling a menu of possibilities. There's also like an archive of kind of historic works that we're slowly porting over to the system, and those range really widely. But we're also doing things like like there's shows that aren't announced yet that are also like basically like record release events, sort of. So it's like someone who has made a recording for their group, and then we're going to make like a special immersive mix of it for Black Hole as just like an alternate reading on how that documentation can exist in the world. And obviously, that doesn't make sense for all pieces and all music, um, but it's also just a really interesting place to listen to something if you're pretty much on headphones or like small home system.
Right, right, right. Okay. Oh man, the whole everything that we're talking about is so rhizomatic and goes in like so many directions. It's hard for me to focus on one line of inquiry. But all right. So here, this is a question that came up for me while you were talking, where you were like, you were talking about the advent of audio technology, and then how these things get kind of bundled into this specific configuration that served the purposes of the music industry, basically. And this happens
Mhm.
relatively early on in the development of this, right? And then
Mhm.
that just kind of brings us to the present, where people just continually relate with audio as synonymous with sound, as synonymous with music, and are just like eating the menu. You know what I mean? Like, now, it, as a means of like elucidating further what you're talking about, in an imaginary past and therefore future where that didn't happen, like audio technology was developed and people just nobody really took any interest in it. Do you know what I mean? Like from a consumeristic capitalist point of view, and it
Yeah.
just was free to develop in this other way that you were talking about. 'Cause some of when you're talking, I'm thinking of like Luigi Russolo and the futurists and doing these kind of like totally non-representational, or if they were representational, it was very figurative. Do you know what I mean? Like sound experiments, But I don't know exactly what you're talking about. But when you're talking about the potential of audio to produce an environment that 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 people can be inside of, which brings me to the quote that I will say that I wanted to say at the beginning of this episode to guide our conversation, which is that this is on your website. Uh, Audio is a temporary social architecture made of air. So if it had been free to just be that and evolve in those terms, not just like incessantly coupled with the machinations of capitalism and the music industry, what would it be?
That's such a good question. Like trying to rewind his layers and layers of history and commerce. Like in practical terms, I mean, part of what I mean is in very practical terms, like there's nothing natural about stereo. Like the fact that you have two ears doesn't mean that you should be listening on two speakers. It means that everything you hear, if you have two ears that are both working equal, is like a two-eared listening experience or a one-eared listening experience or a no-ear. It's not the representation of the stereo field is arbitrary, and there's like really cool things about that as opposed to mono. But in part, I mean something like really basic like that. That it's like if you've experienced something like a more immersive sound system, you would kind of think like stereo was a pretty bad compromise to that. Um, so that's like kind of maybe the less interesting version of what your question is. The more interesting version is like if you were like a cat and someone like like the initial like sales pitch for audio is like the dog listening to the representation of his master's voice and not being able to tell the difference, right? Like that's kind of like the Victrola image we all have burned into our minds. And so it's kind of sold to us like as that from the very beginning.
Right.
Like, my cat doesn't give a shit about representations of music on audio. Like there's no like fooling. He's not fooled by representations of my voice versus my voice. Like it actually is not, the illusion doesn't actually work for like all creatures even. So I think it's part of your question is like it is this because it works. And so then because we're human beings and are like highly susceptible to illusion and technologies of desire, we just get sucked into like the beyond depth representationness of it all. Which I think is only one piece of it. Like the more fantastical version of it is like if none of it is real and it's really just like a technology of representation, then you end up more like, um, there has been a lot of development in things like synthesized sounds, like physical modeling of sounds, like unusual ways of um, treating audio as like a space for fantasy. But I think we would probably have been way further down that line and not have focused as much on like having a gazillion recording studios and everyone has like like a way to like record represent like everyone wants to have like as high quality as possible representations and access to that rather than the idea of like thinking that it is all a virtual space that we're exploring. um,
Right. So wait. So correct me if I'm not understanding this, but I love this point. Like you're saying that like the cat hears John Coltrane or hears Micah Silver's voice and is just like, this is just another new thing that's happening. This isn't like connected to Micah
yeah,
Silver or just
yeah,
like the cat has no historicity like built into its concept. It's not like taking all of this narrative function. Do you know what I'm talking about? Because it's like that's like
it,
that it's like let me just riff for a second. Sorry. It's like
yeah,
because here's what I'm just vibing on your idea. Like because you're right. It's like there's the advent of these technologies, and then just right away it's completely subordinated by the idea of representation, and that's like all it is until Princeton, Columbia Electronic Music Studio, like whatever. That's very esoteric, but
mhm,
dominantly, that's all it is. Until I think you could, this is something we should get to, but you could make the argument that we are getting to like a non-representational place with all media. You know what I
oh
mean?
totally.
So we'll
It's
talk. Sorry.
no, so I was just getting excited because I think like what to me like something really like a really interesting twist in this narrative is like if you think about Spotify, it's like okay, so like independent music, everyone hates Spotify. On the other hand, like Spotify through its massive indexing and as like AI music making, which is really just like the extension of AI is in such a stupid usage space as a word, but like algorithmic music generation is sophisticated enough that like there will never be like another ambient piano record that a human being needs to make. And so there will be like spaces that open up in terms, I think, as technologies advance, the space for human subjectivity becomes more and more clear. And I think like the feedback of audio on music, like if you think of our generation and younger generations, like how recently it was that you would be exposed to music from all over the world. How recently it was that you just like if you want to listen to a certain like type of musical framework, you could do that for like months and months and just like have endless kind of pseudo diverse takes on almost like the same musical structures, variable sound types. And I think like and the first time I heard a version of this idea was from Marianne Amiche, who had this idea that like the future of scores was going to be like kind of like virtual reality games where you would jump through the perceptual apparatus of different creatures, and that like uh, kind of pattern-based music was going to be so wonderfully auto-generated by AI that it would be understood when human beings did it as it was just like you're rearranging, she said, rearranging other men's notes, and like so and you could see that as like this super dystopian thing, or you could see it as actually like this massive awakening of what really is interesting about human subjectivity in music, or what the possibilities are for audio. And you can say the same thing for like I did a talk recently where I lip synced to a AI version of my voice, like giving the intro to the talk. And it's like for $30 you can make a convincing AI version of your voice, right? Like this evening. And so at that point, it's like, okay, audio is no longer testimony. Not only is it like clearly representation, it just becomes extremely murky ethically. So I do think, like, to your point, like we're at a tipping point where I think like this honeymoon period with audio, where people don't really understand it as representation, is certainly coming to a close.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of this is like a continuation of what you're talking about, and we're kind of jumping all over the place, but that's fine.
Yeah.
But no, I'm into that. But I mean, we're okay. Whew, this is a lot. There's a lot going on here. Um, Here's where I'm going to start. I think
Yeah.
that I wonder what you think about this, because I feel like over the last decade and change, I've noticed that there's there's a way of working with images that are non-representational, or that what they represent is just something else. There's like a semantics of images that refer to the logic of the semantics, not to what the images are images of, right?
Mhm.
It's not just this constant trace back to the source. It's like a picture that's featured prominently in a given meme and like an eggplant emoji and like some other thing that adds up to something that has only to do with the internal logic of those semantics. Do you know what I mean? So
Mhm.
so and then with the advent of things like deep fake, you know what I mean, like deep fakes, and then with the kind of overarching pervasiveness of like being manipulated by the mechanisms that bring media to you, right? So there's
Mhm.
this, so there's just a way of working with imagery that is not representational in the way that it has been historically, right? But rather concerned with an internal semantics of the image, right? B, there's a skepticism surrounding all images and where are they coming from, who produced them, why is this appearing in my feed at this time, right? So,
Mhm.
so now back over to audio, I feel like we're reaching a place with music and audio where music is, it's possible that music is entering into a kind of non-dominant role in the cultural sphere, in the sense that like it in the next 50 years music could almost be like, saying you're a musician could almost be like saying you do set design or costume design or something, in the
Mhm.
sense that it is something that people encounter almost only as ancillary to some other media event or theatrical or performative event, right? Like
Mhm.
to put out a record or a track without a video is almost like, what are you even doing? In a more mainstream setting, right? Do you know what I mean? If you're
Mhm.
not in an arena where you know you have a captive audience that just wants to sit down and listen to music, right? That's becoming niche. Do you dig what
Mhm.
I'm saying? Where and
Mhm.
if you're in a non-niche setting, you're deeply concerned with every other part of it. Even if you're ultimately trying to push the music, you almost have to be more concerned with every other part of it than the music. So the music is becoming just kind of like audio and sound. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's like really interesting because I think that's part of the feeling I have that we should start thinking about new types of venues and also new types of organizational structures for where we think these niche forms of music can take place and should take place, and also like where, like why would we replicate the financial model, for example, of like highly successful music products in areas of music that basically have no financialization? So like the kind of music that I imagine you're talking about and that I've been involved with and you've been involved with is like basically has no financial component to it, except like that the people involved are essentially donating to that area of cultural production through unpaid labor. And so it is like more or less a because we don't have a cultural system that actually supports like niche areas of culture that can't participate in the kind of like music video, mass distribution, arena concert, the way that like music is profitable for people in various segments of it, then it sort of also opens up possibilities for thinking like, yeah, why aren't we running more like collective venues? Why are we even trying to um, participate in that space? It may be that like, yeah, I'm really interested in what you said that like in 30 years, it could be far more atomized than we can even see right now.
Right, and it seems like what I was kind of wondering is if there's like a broader overarching kind of dethroning of representation happening across a variety of media. Do you know what I mean? Or like a dethroning is maybe not the best word. A like destabilizing of of the primacy of the idea of representation in a variety of media, whether it be video or photo, for a variety of reasons. And what I'm wondering is, it's like kind of a two-part question. One, does that open possibility for audio in
Hmm.
specifically in terms of the kind of like characteristics that you've been talking about, right? Where it's like
Well,
it needn't to be wed to this, like at this moment in time. Even, I mean, you're right about like the kind of music that we're involved with, but even for like big artists, like it's like
yeah,
unless you're fucking pulling down millions of streams, you're not making any money on that shit. Do you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
So it really needn't be wed to this kind of music industry based capitalist model of record sales or downloads, right? So given that that's already the case, and that there's this kind of widespread destabilizing of the notion of representation, does that open up space for audio to do what you're talking about?
yeah. Thank you for saying that it's not only about niche because it's so true. It's like the level that you have to be at to be making like like a 2020 middle class wage as a full time musician is extreme. Like you have to be extremely popular, and so it's really like, yeah. I mean, the record industry. It's I think we're going to look back on it as like an extremely like minute blip in the history of music and and in the history of representation that was just like a bunch of like vulture companies basically coming in and really messing the kind of the music, and like I'm using the word music specifically, the music culture of the world, and also like and when I say music culture, I mean like tuning systems, instruments. Like the record industry tried really had a lot because of all the capital in it, did a lot of work, colonial work, erasing music cultures all over the world. So I think like there's actually like a whole lot of work to be done as that subsides on that level. But then on the level the level that you were talking about, like I see that the other thing happening is that in response to like just how dominated by media everybody is, of course, like people are also seeking out, especially like younger people, um, like real world, like bodily experiences, like physical places to go with other people. And you see that manifest in like things like crazy music festivals, but also in smaller scale, more interesting stuff. And so I think like, what people call the experience economy, which is now, populated by a lot of kind of like like not that interesting kind of players, um, is actually a very interesting space to think about. Just the idea that like for example, like we have this Catherine Hennick's piece here now, Solitone Star, and there was, I think that she did an interview in the Brooklyn Rail where she was talking a little bit about this. But we had been talking about how Like if you think about a place like the Dream House, or like in her vision of like Solitone Star, this piece is like a few milliseconds long and it loops. And Catherine has been listening to it since 2003 continuously. And so I thought that was like a nice way to start the venue with this like tiny, basically mono piece that goes on forever. And we just played it 24 hours a day. But the idea that, it's a beautiful idea to think that there's a place that exists for just this one sound, you know, as one small possibility of just saying like, how do you use architecture for the creative possibilities of listening? Um, and I do think like also if you think about the way that the spaces we do have for culture that have like advanced audio systems, mostly it's like movie theaters and things like that. There are places where we might start thinking about doing um, like repurposing venues for other types of projects.
Right, right.
But
You're saying like because a movie theater actually does have a relatively sophisticated vehicle for delivering sound.
yeah, you don't need to go see an action movie at a movie theater. I mean, there's all kinds of. I mean, the cool thing about theaters is like the time duration. The whole ritualized durationalness of it. Like you go, you have an expectation. You go there, you sit down, you like focus. Um, and that's the other kind of reason why we're doing this like booking sessions rather than having some kind of like roving installation program that people can kind of wander in and out of. Is that there's something particular and special about establishing some intention to like capture some experience for yourself. Um, and ideally with groups, and right now it's one person per 24-hour period. Um, but the idea is, like a space like Black Hole, my vision for it is like it's a model. It's super expensive space to maintain. It's not a, it's, it can be for like 10, 12, 20 people, maybe maximum.
Wait, Micah, you said it's
Yeah.
not a super expensive place to maintain.
No,
Oh,
yeah, it's
okay.
not. It's not a super expensive place to maintain, and nor, and I think like that's the like I'm trying to start it at this like not entirely DIY punk level, but pretty much. And I think the goal would be to kind of like keep it as these kinds of spaces to keep them flexible and open, and also not like with expensive build-outs and stuff, so that it still feels like a like very approachable space for um, anyone who is looking for some like alternative context to just go do anything. So I mean, the other thing is like there just aren't that many types of places for people to go in general, like culturally speaking. It's like there's people's houses, there's restaurants, there's bars, there's like music venues, there's dance clubs, there's it's like the list of typologies that we have is not like super long.
Yeah, there's like 8.
There's like 8 or 10, right? And so the idea is like I just want to add like maybe one, and the place I want to put it in is like with a very low bar financially, because I think the idea, I mean, in the Dreamland version of Black Hole, it's like we developed this kind of library of programming, and nobody has heard most of it outside of maybe one time when it was premiered or played at some museum or gallery or someplace. But really, the idea is like there could be multiple versions of this type of space, where the material in these kind of sessions could be traded back and forth. More like a bookmobile kind of situation. Um, so yeah, I guess I just feel like, to your point, everything is really destabilized in terms of I think like where the musical and audio culture is going. And an optimistic thing that for me to do is, or that makes me feel optimistic, is just to like create some kind of alternative type of place, type physical place where people can go.
So again, I find myself with a panoply of questions, but um, let's say that just let's just like take as an axiom that it's true that we're at this paradigmatic moment where audio sound begins to lose and ultimately will lose its connection to representation necessarily, right? So it would be my assertion, or rather, it is my assertion that I assert that people people are laboring under the apprehension that that they will be able to make a record that will function representationally and people will relate to it in the way that they relate to a John Coltrane record or what have you, right? And that if you just keep trying, if somebody's gonna be the next that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I've had this feeling for a long time that like they're not making another one of those. Do you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? Like the way that the record industry and radio and history just in general aligned between the 60s and the 90s has passed. It like it was this golden age in a sense. In a way it was very limiting in all the ways that you described because it kind of bound audio up in this relationship to representation and artists and therefore records and sales, right? That really shortchanged audio's possibility, right? But in another way, it catapulted people into this place of like almost like godlike status, which I mean, you know, haters are going to hate, but that was really meaningful to a lot of people. Do you know what I mean? Like having David Bowie and John Coltrane or Alice Coltrane or Yoko Ono or so on and so forth. Like getting to be able to have those kinds of figures had to do with that intersection of technology and music and history, right? And that has elapsed. That's over, right? Now, in our axiom, we're saying that because that's over, audio then detaches from representation, and the possibilities that do exist aren't that, right? And then at the same time, there's a whiplash, right? Where dominantly in music, people are just trying to make the next Love Supreme. I mean, do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, and it's like people are savvy about it. They realize like not everybody's going to listen to your whole record. It's about a track. You have to have like a Spotify playlist. They're kind of like eating around the edges of the idea, but still basically they're like, well, they listen to the track on the Spotify playlist and then maybe they listen to the whole album. They're still very attached to that, like they're going to write the next great novel, basically. Do you follow what I'm saying? But it's like, it's like maybe not going to happen. So what does that mean for all these communities of musicians that are still kind of laboring under this assumption that that's the model that can work?
Well, like I think it can go in a number of ways. Like on one hand, maybe like I like listening. I like going and listening to someone playing music, even if it's like a kid scratching on a violin. It's incredibly beautiful. Like just like the vulnerable act of music making is such a particularly special and vulnerable part of humanness. And I think that there's some like return to maybe a like my hope is that there be some return to like widespread amateur musicianship as part of this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, because like part of the thing is that it's cool that we had, you know, like Michael Jackson is, you know, it's people there's like there have been global phenomena that have changed people's perceptions of like their own bodies and feelings and how they move, and it's like remarkable what these media machines have been able to do. But it is like useful to think. I think it's useful to think of them as like large scale propaganda devices, also, in the same way that you could say that like you know various centralized like religious traditions that have locations all over the world as outposts of particular information, you know, can function as basically like built-in propaganda networks in the same way that TV networks can, websites can, and so that there's a kind of like hyper localness, which kind of is like pre-audio music culture, you know, where it's like if you're going to go experience music, you're going to go down someplace nearby and there's a musician there and you probably know them, or it's like maybe near a city if you don't, but it's just like a much smaller scale operation that has like a heightened intimacy because of that, as opposed to like um, there being this idea of like superstar culture where you're like beholding people who have skills and access and resources and things that you will never have and you believe you will never have. And so I think like that there's a kind of inherently like classist message there, and you see that classist message get more and more explicit with superstardom in terms of like the way the traffic, like the visible trappings of superstardom and how that gets communicated to the public. Um, and so I think like there is some strictly like anti-capitalist positive outcome of this if we want it. You know?
Right. That reminds me of a story that I'm going to tie into your um, your backstory, which is that the last time I was in Guanajuato City, I went on one of those trips with the tuna. You know what I'm talking about? They're not mariachi.
Yeah.
It's like mariachi, but it's a different tradition. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
from
they're like
Spain.
storytellers singing throughout the city at night, wearing like kind of like Baroque clothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. And so I went on one of these like walkabouts with them, my family, myself, my wife, and my daughter. And we got to the end of it, and then we went up that narrow staircase where there's the like kissing corridor where you're supposed to kiss your loved one,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
then you go up the steps, and right before you get to that street, there's a little doorway, and there's this tiny little bar that's been there for over 100 years, and it's where all the mariachi hang out.
Hmm.
It's like the mariachi industry bar. Like when you're just taking a break from going about like causing a public disturbance and singing and entertaining people and whatever, they just
Yeah.
go cut down and have a beer there, right? And it's tiny. It's like itty bitty tiny little place. And so we were just pulling out of there, and I caught a load of it for a second. I was like, "This is sick. Let's go in here." I didn't know what it was. I had no idea. I figured this out about the mariachi hangout, like from hanging out there for a while. And so we go in there, and then this other group comes in, and they're just sitting in the back having beer. They're not mariachi, and but the mariachis are all hanging out by the bar, and they're just like talking shop and comparing notes and whatever. And the people in the table in the back, they're like, "Come on, play us some music." And so then the mariachis that just happen to be hanging out in the bar pull a little pickup group together, and the people at the table are like, "We know all the songs," and so they start singing the songs, and then the mariachi are just like joining them. And so
Hmm.
then there's this like impromptu mariachi performance with these people at the table who are sort of driving the set list, and the mariachi are just backing them up, which is an interesting inversion. And it was fucking incredible. And so the reason I bring this up is because I mean it's hyper intimate. There couldn't have been more than 15 people total in the bar. Myself, the mariachi, the bartender, and these other people included, my wife and daughter. Um, and I mean it's like it will stay with me forever. It's like one of the best music performance experiences of my life. Right now, you compare that to the experience of going to like Terminal Five. It's an objectively bad experience. Do you know what I'm saying? Like going to a giant place like that, uh,
Yeah.
with the exception of very specific things. Like I was a part of hosting Sun O, uh,
Hmm.
Sun. It's called for the heads out there. I know it's Sun. I know. Uh, but I was a part of hosting Sun at Knockdown Center, and there were 2,000 people there, and it was sick. But that's like so hyper specific. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's like for the most part, going and seeing music 2,000 3,000 people at a time sucks. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And somehow well, I shouldn't even say we because I've always thought that shit sucked. But like as a culture, learned to desire that experience. You know what I mean? Which is like it's hard to understand how that happened. I guess it's like fast food. It has a similar kind of quality to like fast food or something. But then again, maybe I'm just an elitist piece of shit and I just don't get it. But at any rate, at least there's something there where you could see how there could be a future in that kind of intimacy.
Yeah, there's so much beauty in the kind of smallness and vulnerability of music making that it's just not, I mean, it's just not possible to scale up, and that's okay, but it's like I think the economy tries to scale everything up. Um, and that's that doesn't mean that it's like kind of what is best for society. It doesn't mean that it's what's best for the people making it even. Like I feel like my experience is also like making music or performing. Um, some of my favorite times doing that kind of thing are also like no one's there, three people are there. Like it doesn't. It's not. We have the idea of spectacle as the apex point of music, um, and it's just not. I mean, there's just no reason to believe that that's true. And certainly, like on a sonic level, like anyone who's been to an arena show, it's like fucking horrible. Like it's unbelievable. It's just like the worst possible. Uh, it's hard to understand like how every time I've been in that situation, I just don't understand how I got there. Like
Right.
um,
Or how
we got
or how you're gonna get out.
yeah. How are you gonna get out? I mean, it's yeah. I mean, like it was making me think about what like a space like MPAC is for.
Hmm.
um, which is like for people who don't know, is like this media art center in upstate New York that I was involved with opening on a curatorial level, where it's like they have. Um, I learned so much from being in those spaces, and that there's something about um, like you can have 1,000 people in a really really beautiful space, and something different happens than when you have 20 people. And that is kind of also like the history of large scale audio systems, is that like there is something magical that happens with just like audienceship. um, but back to like something you said long like earlier in the conversation, it's like just because there's some magic in this kind of like fused air of like thousands of people being together. So like the idea of like, so imagine there's something, if you could see sound, like you would actually see this kind of like complex wave structure bubble thing, like that people are all swimming around in together, and there's something cool in that. But then there's also like a message that's being portrayed on other levels. um, and so it's like we didn't need to take the turn into like the music industry did not need to make stars that we worship on a stage of that sort. It could be used in other ways, in the same way that like it doesn't need to be for like rallies don't need to be for dictators, but like so often they are for dictators.
Right.
um, and so it's something like thinking about audio as a mass, as just like a powerful tool that is also like extremely new, and has never really stabilized very long. It's just that like because of the duration of our lifespan is short enough that it maybe feels um, heavier than it is. But the other thing that came to mind with your story, I think, which was probably Bar Azul, is like um, what's the other thing we're trying to do is work on an alternative set of noise codes, because I think that the other way to think about this issue is like,
I'm sorry, Micah. We black hole. That's what you mean.
yeah, we black hole, and specifically like working with my friend Bill Dietz, like trying to, because noise codes come in basically like, I mean, there's a long history of them, but in the U.S., the latest iterations of them have a lot to do with racial profiling around hip hop. Um, and the question of like how you can use, like Guanajuato is a great example, like Mexico in general, among other countries that have like less policed streets. Just like all kinds of more random self-initiated stuff is allowed to happen in the public sphere. um, you know Particularly around like music and art, never mind commerce. And in a city like LA, I think there's plenty of space to be doing really interesting things outside. But it's like you can't have amplified sound in any park in Los Angeles.
So wait a minute.
you
Let me
know
ask you a question. Are you
sure.
telling me that you're actually working on revamping noise codes?
Yeah, so like black hole, like as part of this idea of like what kind of cultural space it is, we have a few different like programs, say, right? One of them is this like sessions program where people can book time here at the space. Another program is like, um, through my work with Polytope, like where we have all the like officially legal equipment to make noise measurements, and we know how to make noise studies, like that would apply to, for example, like planning and zoning related permitting. Like we're doing pro bono noise surveys for community groups that are trying to like compete with developers who are allowed to commission these like 300-page comprehensive studies to, like in a case nearby here, like permit some warehouse to operate 24 hours a day, like right adjacent a residential neighborhood. Meanwhile, like polluting that neighborhood with like 2,000 truck routes every single day. And the problem is like, so black hole, the idea is to be also thinking of like I would say that it's like a sound question, like as opposed to audio, representation of audio in this space, but also dealing with sound, and like the civic life of listeners and the civic life of like public space as it relates to sound, and to engage in that in like a very concrete like policy level.
Huh. Wait, that's amazing, man. I didn't know. I didn't know that. So you're okay. So if I understand correctly, at Black Hole, you're working on reimagining noise code such that it doesn't um, end up targeting people of color. Basically, you're saying that a lot of noise code is oriented around like the trappings of hip hop, rap music, and like related forms.
Like
Or did I
so
misunderstand you? Maybe I misunderstood you.
yeah, no. So that's part of it. And like so for example, like LA County, is like this massive terrain, and there is like a noise division, and that noise division owns 3 noise meters for the entire county. And there's like three people trained, and like if you look at the noise codes in LA City, LA County, like it's super quantitative, right? And in theory, that would mean that like you would need, uh, someone would need to like make some kind of complaint. There would need to be some real analysis of the situation. But in effect, like what ends up happening is just that like a beat officer is given the right to more or less subjectively decide that something is too loud. And it comes into play, um, like 80s, 90s with hip hop in terms of like car audio and also like boom boxes and stuff like that. So it's like a way to, yeah, I mean, it is a way to like police people of color in public space in a completely non-quantitative, like, yeah, like basically a purely subjective way that's explicitly about profiling. So in part
Right.
it's about that history, and it's also a part of privileging industrial noise and polluting noise from freeways over, like if you can allow a freeway to produce, I live like 300 feet from a freeway. I hear it all the time, right? So it's like you can allow a freeway to put out like 80 dB, 90 dB of sound constantly, but someone wants to like put on party in their backyard for 100 people for 2 hours, and the cops will show up and like arrest everybody or kick everyone out or something. So there's also kind of like uh, ways that policing what sound is allowed and what sound isn't allowed. It is like definitely, it is not only about like cultural biases and ethnic biases, but it's also about like the economy and the way that, um, yeah, like noise associated with capitalism is prohibited, and noise associated with community is prohibited.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a really, I mean, that's such an interesting and just lame thing. Like, to be the person, like, I can never imagine being this person that's like, that just gets to a point with someone having a party where you have to call the police. It's like it's just so impossible for me to imagine doing that. You know what I mean? And it's such an incredible thing. Like conversely, when like you're saying like in Mexico where it's just more permissive. You know what I mean? Like you don't just you for the most part, if you're out on a Friday and Saturday in Mexico, it's not that you hear a mariachi band. It's that you hear like 3 or 4 at once, basically the whole time, unless you're like getting out on the outskirts of town. You know what I mean? If you're anywhere where you might want to be on a Friday or a Saturday, you hear the mariachi band that's like right in front of you, and then you hear the 2 or 3 that are like in earshot of you, but not right in front of you. You know what I mean? But like somehow that doesn't become something where somebody there is like, this is ridiculous. You know what I mean? It feels like they need to, and like, who would they even call anyway? But like, but that's
It's a
like
different,
beautiful. That's
yeah.
a beautiful thing.
I think it just like it points to the what a like highly prohibitive, highly policed, society does to also our sense of the kinds of things we can do and the kinds of events we can produce. Where your music belongs. Like I think it points to this feeling like music and audio. It is like about making places maybe more than it is about making music.
Mm-hmm.
And where and how those places are shaped are, and the way that we can like foresee our lives and foresee like the paths that we would take as artists or producers or thinkers about this stuff. Like all this policy shit, unfortunately, makes its way into your subconscious and biases you deeply against yourself, your own community, your own sense of place. And it's kind of, it's like intellectually kind of interesting, but I mean, the work, doing this work is going to be like complicated and arduous in terms of with the nuts and bolts of actually like making some arguments here in Los Angeles. But I think it's part of like how we would need to like restabilize what music and audio mean in an era where it is like there is no reason for people interested in like kind of the more experimental side or even just the more communitarian side of music making to participate in the systems that will never repay you, will not support you, will not like, I mean, it's just extractive. Like it's resource extractive. And so I feel like we will need to come up with like situations where we're building alternatives that are like the world that we want to live in.
Right. And so Polytope, which is another thing I wanted to ask you about while you were on here. Polytope, you guys are actually, you have the equipment, you have the capacity, and you're actually volunteering to go out and do for organizations who have some need to make sound or noise what otherwise these three LA police officers with these meters can do, right? Like you help these people produce their own science and math about what's actually happening noise-wise, because you can do that, and so you're offering those services to people.
Well, like what happened, like it's a little different than that, which I must not have explained it clearly, but it's like what happens around, in any like rapidly gentrifying city, Los Angeles being one of them. I mean, most like coastal cities are experiencing the same thing. So developers have huge amount of capital and they hire all their own consultants, actually forced by the city because the cities don't have very much money. So like, let's say you want to develop a gigantic, like, fancy condo structure that's going to have 500 units in some neighborhood, right? One of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have to do like a whole environmental review of that project. And one component of that will almost always be like some kind of official noise survey that says that you are not going to, break all of the various noise codes and like keep people up at night, et cetera, right? But the problem is that the cities don't have the money to hire those consultants on their own. And so the developers the industry around those reports and the quantitative information on which you would like use to argue against that kind of development. The consulting industry around that stuff is basically, you only would get hired if you tell the developer like, hey, no problem, like no problem. Of course there's going to be no noise. Like, just put up this like 8-foot plywood wall and that's going to solve the problem forever. And just get it past the planning commission, and then the project goes up, and then it's over. And then you're calling those 3 people with a meter to complain. So the time to deal with the more like industry-based noise and kind of development-based impact is really like early on in the life cycle. So what we're doing is approaching, and offering community groups that are like in the position to operate against these developments that will have a negative community impact, and basically give them like quantitative means to contest the developers' reports on this stuff.
Man, that's amazing that you're doing that. That's really cool and incredibly valuable, and it's something that I've I've always been on the other side of that equation, where like one of the venues that I ran, we had noise issues, which were legitimate, to be frank. I mean, it's like one of those things. You run a club in New York, you make noise. I mean, now I'm in a basement. I actually don't make that much noise for people who aren't somehow implicated in this thing.
Yeah.
But it's a common thing. And I went down the whole thing with the meter, and like they go stand at some traffic intersection, 3 blocks away, and they take the sound reader, and then if you're above X amount, if you're X amount above that on your corner, then you're in violation. And to be frank, we were in violation. Like, so yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm. It's somebody should have stopped us, and they did stop us. but that's a cool thing, man. But that does open up onto polytope agencies. So can you tell us what that is? Like, what does polytope agency do other than this magnificent project that you just described? Like, what do you do in that setting? Like,
So like the Polytope agency like is a it's a collection of people who I think are trying to address gaps in the way that cultural institutions are designed and built for listening. And so, and that can like, so for example, like um, most facilities are built like completely without a lot of attention paid to either programming relating to music or sound. And I'm sure you've had this experience working with museums and other cultural spaces where it's either like extremely expensive or confusing or sound bad or you have noise issues or whatever it is. Um, that there's Polytope agencies and it gets involved with like early stage cultural development projects for things like new museums, but also does consulting for um, like exhibits and other things like that, which is like a combination of like sound design, kind of helping people conceptualize like complicated audio projects, um, and then like producing them start to finish. So it's kind of like on the one hand, you could say it's like the commercial side of things that also allows Black Hole to exist through like relocation of resources from like a venture that has some relationship to the marketplace and one that has like explicitly no relationship with the marketplace. But the goals are kind of aligned in that, um, yeah, like a place like MPAC, which was so thoughtfully designed for working with audio and sound and music. Most new cultural institutions are not at all designed with that attention. It's like the idea that human beings are synesthetic creatures where you're always listening. The sonic dimension of everything has as much impact as what it looks like. And so we're trying to kind of like build some kind of discipline in between a few different disciplines there that work with architects, for like people like AV integrators get involved with just like spraying speakers throughout the entire facility. So it's I don't know if that clarifies it, but it's kind of
yeah.
like we call what we're doing like audio scenography,
Wait, what
which
do
is
you call it?
audio scenography.
Oh, okay.
So to think of like lighting or the visual effect is like a scenographic medium, that it's like of course like the oral dimension of any place you are also has like a scenographic component. And what we have learned, and in part for me, like through watching MPAC be the opposite, is that it's very rare that there are people involved in the construction of these projects that are kind of thinking at every stage of it about um, like the listening scene of the whole thing. And so the goal there is like it then opens up these spaces when built to like more interesting possibilities down the line. Um, but we also work with like other artists and creative directors and stuff on exhibits and it can be at many different levels. But like the macro goal is basically to establish that as a necessary part of the conversation for the creation of like larger scale cultural spaces.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. This for me kind of loops back around to what we were talking about with the disintegration of audio from the commercial record industry bundle,
Mm-hmm.
and to begin thinking about audio in terms of its own potential rather than in terms of being a component of this capitalist vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So here, this is like there's kind of this conundrum that I notice crop up around moments of great insight where where tremendous insight is often, and importantly not always but often, inversely proportional to the visibility or like consumability of the product of that insight. Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of like I'm really into this writer Fred Moten. I don't know if you
Mm-hmm.
know Fred Moten's work, but I mean it's
Mm-hmm.
stunning. And I'm really into Donna Haraway. Do you know what I mean? And it's like these people are famous in their world and at the same time radically esoteric. I mean,
Hmm.
if you went and took a flight anywhere in US, I would bet against you every time that if you just looked over to the person next to you and said, "Hey, man, did you check out that new Fred Moten book?" that they would have any idea what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like I'd put $1,000 on it every flight. Do you know what I mean? I mean, this is obscure stuff. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
at the same time, I mean, something that you really actually could say on behalf of the record industry in the sort of like latter half of its heyday is that it did furnish relatively small scale musical operations with a means of deriving income. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Um, and like you could lead like a kind of lower middle class life touring and selling records, and you could make money selling records, even if you're like a pretty obscure artist, and
Hmm.
it's interesting, right? Because you can look at music making, sound making in different periods of history. There's always some part of society is always propping it up, right? It's the record industry and just like commercial, it's the university, it's the church, it's the court, just like some cat that just wants a lot of gestures and shit, like the Duke of Burgundy needs a fucking birthday piece written for him, or like what, you know what I mean? There's always like a place in society that's kind of like funneling resources somehow into musical production, right? In the Middle Ages, it's obviously the church, right? So
Hmm.
in this new like audioscape, right, laboring under this new paradigm, which I love this idea of this like rhizomatically interconnected array of intimate spaces. What are musicians and sound makers doing? Who are they? Does it automatically just have to then get built into the university and museums and stuff? Because that feels to me to be kind of socially anticlimactic.
Anticlimactic.
Yeah,
Climactic.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, like,
Yeah.
yeah. Maybe I'm not saying that word correctly, but I think you
I
know what I'm
think
talking
I
about.
think it's like it's one of those things where you uh, maybe both strata are worth pursuing at the same time, and it's like the because access is such that like people will still go to big museums um, in a way that maybe they don't find out about like a space like black hole for, um, for a long time or ever, even if it's like 5 blocks from their house, and that there's some like crosstalk between those spaces. But um, I guess like I'm really excited by the idea of um, small scale venues that are kind of decoupled from any kind of financial purpose to the music making or audio. And I think those are the kinds of places that have often inspired me the most personally, and also feel like the most open ended in terms of like what someone can do or how someone can use a space. So I think there is that like um, yeah, I think that's really optimistic. At the same time, I'm sometimes I think about experimental music as some kind of like libertarian cult, and like and where you think like if everyone like in Adorno's dream where like no one like if every piece is like a completely new piece construction concept of music every single time, like how does anyone ever dance together? How does anyone ever like sing the same song? And so they're it's also that they're just are like music is maybe too small a word for what all of the range of activities that encompass it now. And the same for like types of practices with audio, like you're saying there's like representational attempts, but then there's all these other kind of uses of it that range from like ecological to documentarian to legal to like you know podcasts. Like it's all over the place in terms of what. And so it can be that like these things will become more clear, but that also suggests to me that like we need physical places that embody some of those purposes,
Hmm.
like particularly.
Yeah, no, you touched on a number of things there, but what the thing that you're talking about experimental music, I mean, something, this is just actually kind of on some sidebar shit, but like something that I think is not forthrightly addressed enough or really ever in experimental music and by experimental musicians is just that, like, nobody wants you to do this. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like okay, yes, there's this like niche clique that you can kind of go on this like lifelong journey and do this kind of like esoteric misanthropic social thing, and eventually maybe you get to play like Issue Project Room or Blank Forums or like you know what I'm saying? Okay, like point taken, but it's like all along the way, people are like, why don't you just do anything but that? I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's like, it's literally just like you're doing this thing that just nobody wants you to do. Do you know what I mean? And it's like,
You know,
that's cool. Like, I think that's cool, but I think we should talk about it more.
the thing that yeah, like I think that I spent like too much of my life trying to understand that like choices like that, and or like what was I so like I got into. I mean, like in high school, I was basically like this. I was living in the middle of the woods, like in a town of 800 people. There was really the internet was like only text, and I had never heard of like the phrase free jazz until I had accidentally like gone to Wesleyan to study with someone I thought was Jay Hogarth, who turned out to be Anthony Braxton. And it's like what is it that attracted me so much to the feeling of that music? Or what attracted me so much to, for probably 10 years, just like seeking out, listening to things that I didn't understand or I thought were ugly or hard to comprehend or had some dimension in them, like temporally, timbrally, conceptually, that I didn't like or that I couldn't understand or I couldn't like swallow easily. And so I feel like for me, I have sort of come to this feeling like one of the core questions that experimental music asks that is really valuable in a society like ours is to just ask people to like think about things that they don't immediately like in a very, very basic way. On another level, it's like just giving people an awareness of alternative possibilities is also extremely important. Um, and then like on an even maybe like a deeper level that, um, and this is more like what you think music is or does, is that like for me, I sort of feel like, you know, music, maybe like poetry, like it encapsulates syntactically, rhythmically, like referently, um, it ritualizes certain sets of values from a certain time and place and a certain group of people. And that like what's part of what's weird about living in like a post audio era, which is also just like only a few generations have ever dealt with reality, like musical sonic reality in this way, is that all of those artifacts kind of like layer on top of each other into what we think music might mean. But it also is like this incredible opportunity to like experience wider ranges of like psychic, psychoethnic, geographic history and ritual. Um, and I do think like for me anyways, the way that I entered experimental music felt like it was coming from a pretty earnest place of just like trying to expand my ways of thinking through ways of listening, And so it's like if like that's the other thing with that's like important that we say in the black hole, like as soon as you get to the website, is like it's about the curatorial purview is to diagram ways of listening. And so the idea is like the thing that's interesting to listen to in this kind of space would be something which is making some ask of you that's particular in terms of like the way that you're not, it could be like listening in terms of like what's actually in the recording, but it could be like how you're actually listening or thinking about like the fact of the recording too. Um, as usual, that's like an elliptical answer to your. I feel
No,
like
no, that
all of
was
my
an
interesting
incredible
points
answer,
use,
man.
uh,
No, that was amazing. That was amazing because you have an answer, and it was a great answer. And I'm speaking the point of my this kind of like defamatory thing that I said about experimental music, which I say in jest. I'm an experimental musician, but but it is legit. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah,
you have to afford the thing that you do, the scrutiny that you would afford a family member, right? Like, um,
yeah,
and like the thing is that if you aren't thinking about why you're doing that, right? Like what you're talking about, um, you can arrive at this place where you feel where the energy you're putting in the world is like is more like I'm allowed to do this. Do
yeah,
you know what I mean? And it's like that's where it gets that libertarian vibe. It's just like
yeah.
where it's like, and I think that that's like facilitated and expedited by um, the extent to which um, experimentalism has actually broken away from evaluation of stimulating and inviting people to consider aversion, which I think factored prominently into what you were talking about, right? It's like this presentation of this challenging content that opens up a possibility for people to consider why they find it challenging, right? And all of these residency programs and MFAs and special, settings and things like this encourage people, wittingly or unwittingly, to, or maybe it encourages the wrong word, but it presents the opportunity to step outside of that commitment to aversion, to
Mhm.
stimulating aversion and like confronting that. You know what I mean? But it's cool that it's present in your response to that commentary. But I do think I share that feeling that you described of like of like experimentalists becoming these little like I'm allowed to do this, man. I can do whatever I want. There's like do you know what I'm saying? Which is like hilarious. But you know what? This other thing that came up when you were talking, man, when we were talking about like what's the model for music making if it's not the music industry, right? And we were looking at like thinking about like past places where musicians have derived livelihoods and space and whatever. Something that occurs to me with uh, this kind of idea about the potential of the intimate setting is that bringing it back to the mariachi model is so brilliant because it does intimacy in volume. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
It's like what they do is go have a lot of intimate experiences in like one night. Do you follow what I mean? Like that's the problem with free jazz, right? It's like if you played 35 times a night to 10 people, that would be sick. Do you know what I'm saying? But it's like
Yeah.
if you play one time a night to 10 people, it's just presents an economic problem. Do you know what I mean? But it's like that's resolved by the mariachi by just playing to 10 people 35 times. Do you know what I mean?
It's like I think that the part of the reason to do this like infinite bookable editions at Black Hole is like the mariachi thing is like an anti-scarcity model. It's like they are available and around, and they have like something that they're actually trying to give, um, and it's like very accessible. It's
Oh yeah.
not like super precious, and like the precious forms of it aren't that. It's actually something entirely different. And so I think it's like there's like a funny intersection between like the perceived preciousness of performing something like free jazz and how that doesn't actually serve like the I don't know, like the feeling matrix of that work and its audienceship.
Right,
And
and
there's
there's
something.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But there's important examples of that anti-scarcity model within free jazz. You know what I mean? There is actually like Charles Gale. Daniel Carter is like a living example of somebody who's super anti-scarcity. He just plays
Yeah,
as much as he can, and it's sick. Sonny Rollins on the bridge. Like there is that kind of busking, like there's more where that came from kind of attitude within that trajectory. Um,
and even with the recordings, like I was thinking of like Braxton's discography, where it's
right.
just, and I remember he was describing that in class at some point as like inspired by like later Coltrane's discography, where like it goes from being like very precious records to actually like exploding into like many many different releases with increasingly divergent groups of people. Um, but I like that. Yeah, what's the other example he would give is like Sun Ra's like short edition kind of like Sonic newspaper releases. Um, and
Well, wait, tell us about those. I don't actually know about that.
well, just like that, there were releases like kind of more like self-made releases by the orchestra that had like very limited runs, and that like at least the way Braxton described it in the course he taught on Sun Ra was that like the way he conceived of those things were more like, there's like the continuous operation of Sun Ra's collective, which is like everyone is living together, rehearsing all the time. And then there's these like dispatches. So there's like a continuous thing happening. And then there's like dispatches outwards from this continuous thing, rather than there being like a wedged form where it's like, we're preparing for this particular thing that's gonna like peak at this moment and then like we'll stop while the thing gets released. It's sort of
Right.
I guess maybe it's like a different idea about just like what the record industry also could have been.
No,
So
that's so interesting, man. That's so interesting. And there's so much utility for that kind of thinking right now because it's like, right, because people are still like laboring under this assumption that, like, I mean, I feel like actually, like, scarcity has ramped up in the last 10, 15 years because, like, in order to get a record out, it used to be that you had to go tour relentlessly and you had to really impress upon a record label that, like, we've been to all these places, we've been to all these towns 3 times, like, people will buy the record there, we'll go back out on tour, we'll sell the record there. And that model really shifted away from that to where it was like record labels are more interested in finding something that nobody knows about and then actually preventing them from playing so that they can just completely control the narrative about what that thing is, so that
mhm.
so that when they do eventually, release the music in as like gammeted with like a festival play or something, they have total control over what's messaged. Where was it? How many people were there? What did the photographs look like? What was the video like? And leading up to it, none of it is live. It's all like non-representational. It's all like video and photos and sound that's completely doctored, and like you can just totally like cinematographically like produce this experience that people then show up at this one thing and expect to have, and it's like, and they believe it because it's what they've been told, and that's like hyper scarcity. Do you know what I mean? Like even the model where you were going to tour and tour and tour and then eventually put out a record, you're isolating that moment on the timeline where you put out the record. That can only happen one time, right? But like that, there's a much more like anti-scarcity model, and like, yeah, get out and tour the country 3 times, play 250 shows, like it's fine. Like, do you know what I mean? But yeah, no. But what you're talking about, this like antidote to that being this like constant kind of shedding of content in small numbers that goes out in like different directions depending on where you are or something, as like an antidote to that scarcity model. That's really fascinating. That and the mariachi. Yo, last line of inquiry for me. You're welcome to throw out many lines of inquiry and flight and drift or whatever. Um, okay, audio as transubstantiation and or AI. So okay,
Yeah.
spill that tea. Unpack that.
Oh man, that's like late in the conversation. I have to fire that one up. Like the thing is like, well, the transubstantiation piece is sort of simple. Like in that, like what do we think that a microphone is doing? Like what do we think a microphone is extracting from an environment if it is successful at creating a representation on the other end of whatever kind of like audio process cycle that we would believe is like a testimony to some humanness or human situation. So like we talked about it before, but I think the only word for that would be that like you think that there is some like human energy that is taken out of time and space and somehow able to be encapsulated and then redeployed later, transformed as an overlay into some other like lived time and space. And so like I think that audio does is so it seems unquestionable that we use audio as if it is doing that, which is not which is only to me points to the question of like, well, why, what is it, um, what is like the trans substance of audio? That's the question. And so then like, so what is this like enoughness that can travel through a microphone, through like whatever transformations, even if it was like a wax cylinder, right? So like there's not even a microphone, it's like someone is screaming into like a metal cone and it's like cutting in real time into wax. You know, people collect that shit and still believe that it's like a guitar and someone singing. When if you thought about it from a timbral perspective, there's no way that it's a representation of a guitar and someone singing. And so like my what I like put out there is that it has everything to do with the quantification of time and a kind of like the use of sonic gesture in time, and that's kind of for me that's actually kind of the key to the question of what's actually happening and why it works is somewhere in there, which has to do with like transporting temporalities from one location to another as overlays, and our imaginations being so good at that for whatever reason that we fill in the rest.
Yeah, I mean, it does. When you think about it, it feels almost like it's either just completely false or it just is metaphysics. I mean, it's just right. I mean, it's like
Well, that's the question. It's like, do we want to believe that? Like, so for example, like Pauline Oliveros, my interpretation, she was at RPI at the same time I was at MPAC, and she had this like internet two link between the studio there in Stanford and people improvising and stuff. Um, and I think that like you can experience a sense of connectedness of presence across time and space. Like even now we're talking, and it's like I'm looking at you, you're looking at a representation of me in the room, and it's like I haven't seen you in like a decade or you know years and years. I haven't actually seen you, but I have a sense that like Sam's presence is here, and we're in this conversation together. When it's like that's not actually what's happening. You know, like we're sending footballs across like a very like large representational divide. But I think there are people like I think Pauline would have said something like, actually, there is like a metaphysical thing that's happening, and we're finding each other, and it's more like astral projection, where like you know we are using these tools as a way to like psychically locate each other across time and space, and that's why the conversation is happening the way it is. You know, and I actually sort of, whether I believe that or not, I prefer that to the idea that some recent like kind of basic technology parlor trick is so cool that like we can't tell the difference. Because to me that's like a kind of more depressing result, or it
right,
points
right.
somewhere else, you know.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating, man, because it does feel the way that you describe, like when you're listening to a record, and in some ways, especially like an older record, it does feel like you're importing like a temporality from another time. Um, I don't think we're gonna crack this case tonight, but that is fucking fascinating, man.
Yeah, thank you. We don't have to crack it, but the just to like to riff a little bit on the AI part of it,
Oh yeah, hit
which
it.
is that like if you think so like people are using the word AI in such a murky way, and usually at this point really they're just saying like high quality algorithms. You know, people have pretty
Hmm.
much like let go of the idea of you know like some kind of like human sentimentality or like sentientness, and they're just there's just the word is sprayed on like everything from like elevator control mechanisms to like teacups, you know. So it's but what I actually mean is more like the old harsher like harder to achieve definition of AI, which would be that like if there is some kind of human presence that feels like a human intelligence, or just you could just say like presence that you can invoke through this technology, then is it true that audio is like has been a sleeper like AI that is populating all of our lives, communicating all kinds of really interesting um, kind of beyond representation. Actually, if it is actually communicating this level of subtlety and delicate humanity to us, then should we consider like that in the affective range of what would have really been an AI? And what does that mean then that like our lives have been thoroughly populated by audio for, like 75 years, but really like accelerating since the Walkman, right? So like since the 80s, you could say it's like it's everywhere. All of our devices, everything is we're being surrounded by all of these audio projections.
Right.
So that's kind of yeah.
And also that like if you layer in this quality of like you're you're working with this idea that you're importing something from the past and then at the same time more like materially or more like accurately in a sense like you're actually just generating an experience. Like I mean this kind of is something that I was
Yeah.
thinking about while you were talking about audio and black hole the whole time, which is just that listening is generative. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? And so there's this weird confusion in a sense about connecting recordings of music to the past and then and accelerating the rate at which we consume those things and therefore feel like we're getting information about the past or becoming informed by the past, right? And then at the same time accelerating the rate at which we're generating these experiences that have nothing to do with the past. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so there's just this like palimpsest of psychic, creative, cultural production that's like hard to understand.
It's really hard. It's like it's hard to understand, but it's also like what it makes me think about is just how hard it is to really see your world, like how hard has been historically for people to see themselves in their own time, and how hard it is like and the rate of acceleration in terms of like mass representational technologies in the past 100 years. Like I think that would make it even harder for us to really understand the kind of mud that we've been swimming around in.
Oh yeah.
And so like the reason I like pushing that AI piece is thinking of like maybe it's the most successful AI and like no one even really realized it was AI because it was like in the like the AI format of it is actually in this kind of like temporal extraction. And yeah, it's really trippy to think about like if that's true. And I like to think about it this way, and I tend to think of ideas as like clothes. Like you can kind of like try them on and run around with them and see how they feel for a few years, and see what happens to you if you're wearing the idea. Um, and I've sort of like stuck with this one for a while. I still don't know if it's like a unreasonable. If I just like it because it makes audio feel even more magical to me than it already did. Uh,
Yeah, man, that's fascinating. I gotta say, that's like actually really, really. I mean, not. I shouldn't use the word actually. You're obviously deep, but it's like that. That is really, really a deep cut, man. I'm gonna try that on and wear that around. But Micah, this has been really sick and really deep, and I have a lot to think about, man.
Me too. Sam, thanks so much for being Sam, asking me such amazing questions. And what a like a cool way to catch up with you, having been thinking like in parallel distant courses for so many years now. So,
Yeah, 100%, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Um, I'm gonna do my little outro. Feel free to hang out or whatever. But I'm gonna
okay.
address the masses out there on Twitch. But folks, Micah Silver, Black Hole, LA, Polytope, and so on. This guy is heavy duty, as you just saw. Um, so this is a place of assembly. Hollow, Experimental Sound Studio, Chicago, 8 Ball Radio. Support us on Patreon, patreon.com/hollow. Our music, our theme music is Art Jam on the Quantum Natives label based in Taipei. Check them out. They're sick. We're featuring them this series. And yeah, this has been fun. Next week, big episode next week. We've got Will's Glass-Spiegel and Lightbulb of the Era Footwork Collective from Chicago. Well, Will's Glass-Spiegel, I should say, it's not actually part of the Era Footwork dance collective, but is a documentarian who's done a lot on that work and supported that community a lot. And my co-host next week will be Ashok Dapwell Kondabolu of Das Racist and the Kondabolu Brothers podcast and so forth. It's going to be dope, so tune in and go out with some tunes, and thank you, everybody.